She woke in the ICU to machines breathing for her, metal rods piercing through her shattered leg, broken ribs, punctured lung. The truck had nearly killed her. But when she reached for her husband's hand, she found empty air. 36 years of marriage. She'd sacrificed everything. Her career, her dreams, her voice. And when she was at her most vulnerable, fighting for her life in that hospital bed, he wasn't there. He'd filed for divorce the day after her accident. Emptied their bank accounts while she was unconscious. Moved in with another woman while surgeons pieced her body back together. The man who'd promised to love her in sickness and in health had abandoned her when she couldn't fight back. This is the story of how she survived. Not just the accident, but the betrayal that came after. The morning of November 14, 2023, began like every other morning in the Palmer household on the quiet, tree-lined street of Westbury Avenue in Fort Wayne. Margaret Palmer, 58 years old, woke at 5:30 to the sound of her husband Robert's alarm clock. She silenced it before it could wake him fully, a habit she'd developed over their 36 years of marriage. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Through the bedroom window, she could see the amber glow of streetlights illuminating the neighborhood she'd called home since 1987. Fort Wayne in November meant frost on windshields, pumpkins still decorating porches, and the quiet rhythm of Midwestern life she'd grown to cherish. Margaret moved through the dark house with practiced ease, her slippers whispering against the hardwood floors Robert had insisted on installing 10 years ago. She started the coffee maker, the gurgling sound filling the silence of their 4-bedroom colonial home. The kitchen was her domain, though she'd stopped thinking of it as such years ago. It was simply where she existed, where she served. At 6:15, she placed Robert's breakfast on the table. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with butter on the side, fresh squeezed orange juice, and coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. The same breakfast she'd prepared 5 days a week for over 3 decades. The precision of it had become automatic, muscle memory replacing thought. Robert appeared at 6:30, already dressed in his gray suit, his thinning hair combed carefully over his balding crown. At 62, he carried himself with the self-assurance of a man who'd spent his career in middle management at Lincoln Financial Group downtown. He sat without greeting her, unfolding the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette she'd already retrieved from the front porch. "Traffic's backing up on Clinton Street again," Margaret said, attempting conversation. "You might want to take Jefferson," Robert grunted, eyes never leaving the newspaper. Margaret poured herself coffee and stood at the counter, not sitting. She'd learned years ago that sitting suggested leisure, and leisure suggested she wasn't ready to attend to whatever he might need. Their daughter Jennifer had moved to Indianapolis 12 years ago. Their son Michael was stationed in South Korea with the Army. The house that had once buzzed with children's voices now held only silence and the rustle of newspaper pages. "I'll be late tonight," Robert said, folding the paper. "Meeting with the new regional director." "I'll keep dinner warm," Margaret replied automatically. He stood, grabbed his briefcase, and walked toward the garage door without kissing her goodbye. That small intimacy had disappeared somewhere around their 20th anniversary, replaced by efficiency and routine. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as his silver Lexus backed out of the driveway. Only then did she allow herself to sit, her coffee now lukewarm in her hands. The emptiness of the house pressed against her like a physical weight. She'd given up her nursing career when Jennifer was born in 1987. Robert had insisted one parent needed to be home, and his job at Lincoln Financial paid better. "It's just temporary," he'd said, "until the kids are in school." But school came and went, and somehow temporary became permanent. Her friends from nursing school had gone on to become nurse practitioners, hospital administrators, educators. She'd watched their careers flourish through occasional Christmas cards, each one a reminder of the path she'd abandoned. At 58, she knew that path was closed to her now. Her nursing license had expired. The medical world had evolved beyond her knowledge. She was unemployable in the field she'd once loved. The morning stretched ahead with its familiar tasks. Laundry in the basement, dusting the living room Robert rarely used, grocery shopping at the Kroger on Coldwater Road, preparation for a dinner Robert might or might not eat. This was her life, measured in clean floors and folded clothes and perfectly timed meals. At 10 o'clock, she drove their older Honda Civic to Kroger. November in Fort Wayne meant bundling against the cold, watching your step on potentially icy parking lots, nodding to neighbors you'd known for decades but never truly befriended. Margaret had learned to be pleasant but not close. Closeness required emotional energy she'd stopped having years ago. In the produce section, she ran into Dorothy Chen, a woman from her book club that met monthly at the public library downtown. Dorothy was 61, recently retired from teaching, her face open and animated as she talked about her upcoming trip to visit her daughter in Seattle. "You should come to book club Thursday," Dorothy said. "We're discussing the Midnight Library. It's wonderful." "I'll try," Margaret said, knowing she wouldn't. Robert didn't like her going out in the evenings. He never said it directly, but his disapproval hung in the air like smoke when she mentioned activities outside the house. By 3 in the afternoon, the pot roast was in the slow cooker, filling the house with the rich smell of beef and vegetables. Margaret ironed Robert's shirts for the week, the hiss of steam and the warmth of the iron oddly comforting in their predictability. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "Mom, can we talk this weekend? Need advice about something?" Margaret's heart lifted momentarily. Communication with her daughter had become sporadic, brief exchanges about weather and holidays. She texted back immediately. "Of course, sweetheart. Call any time." But even as she sent it, she felt the familiar ache. Jennifer had learned to keep her distance, had watched her mother's diminishment over the years, and chosen a different path. Her daughter was a marketing director, owned her own condo, traveled for work. She'd absorbed the lesson Margaret had inadvertently taught. Never become so dependent on a man that you lose yourself entirely. At 7:30, Robert still wasn't home. Margaret covered the pot roast and sat in the living room, the television playing but her mind elsewhere. She thought about the nursing journals she used to read, the satisfaction of helping patients, the camaraderie with other nurses. She thought about the woman she'd been at 22, full of purpose and ambition. When had she stopped being that woman? There was no single moment, no dramatic event. Just a slow erosion, grain by grain, year by year, until she looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. A woman who'd become wallpaper in her own life. Robert came home at 9:15, smelling of wine and expensive perfume, not his brand. Never his brand. "Dinner's ready," Margaret said. "Already 8," he replied, heading upstairs. Regional director took us to Club Soda downtown. She stood in the kitchen, looking at the pot roast she'd spent hours preparing. Then she wrapped it carefully, stored it in the refrigerator, and cleaned the kitchen until it sparkled. That night, lying in bed beside Robert's sleeping form, Margaret stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was all there was. 36 years of service, of sacrifice, of slowly disappearing. Tomorrow would be another Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday, each day identical to the last. She didn't know that tomorrow would shatter everything. That the ordinary world she'd built from duty and denial was about to collapse entirely. That by this time tomorrow, she'd be fighting for her life while the man sleeping beside her planned his escape. The last thought she had before sleep was simple and devastating. When did I stop mattering? November 15th, 2023, began with freezing rain. Margaret woke to the sound of ice pellets hitting the bedroom window, the kind of weather that made Fort Wayne roads treacherous. By 6 a.m., local news was reporting multiple accidents on I-69 and warnings to avoid unnecessary travel. Robert dressed quickly, agitated. Regional director wants me in early. Budget meeting. The roads are terrible, Margaret said, watching the ice accumulate on their driveway through the window. Maybe wait an hour for the salt trucks. I can't wait. This meeting determines next year's headcount. He grabbed his briefcase, barely looking at her. Don't wait up tonight. Probably be late again. After he left, Margaret sat with her coffee, listening to the radio announcer list school closings and accident reports. She had her own errand today, one she'd been postponing. Her mother, Eleanor, was in Parkview Haven nursing home on the north side of the city. At 84, Eleanor's dementia had progressed to the point where she rarely recognized Margaret anymore, but duty demanded weekly visits. Margaret hadn't told Robert about the credit card bill. The nursing home cost $4,000 monthly, and Medicare only covered part of it. She'd been using her secret credit card, the one she'd opened years ago in case of emergency, to cover the difference. The balance had climbed to $18,000. She knew she had to tell him, but the thought of his anger made her stomach clench. By 10 a.m., the freezing rain had slowed to a drizzle. The temperature hovered at 31 degrees. That dangerous zone where roads looked wet but were actually sheets of ice. Margaret knew she should wait, but guilt about missing last week's visit to her mother pushed her out the door. The Honda's tires crunched on the ice as she backed carefully out of the driveway. Westbury Avenue was deserted. The salt trucks had hit the main roads but not the residential streets. She drove 15 miles per hour, hands tight on the steering wheel. Parkview Haven was across town, a 20-minute drive in good weather. Today, it would take 40 minutes. She made it to Coldwater Road safely, her confidence growing slightly. A thin layer of salt grit gave some traction on the main road. Eleanor was having a bad day. She didn't recognize Margaret, kept calling her Susan, her long-dead sister. Margaret sat beside the bed in the sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and old age, holding her mother's papery hand and talking about nothing. Her mother had been a strong woman once, a widow who'd raised 3 children working as a seamstress. Now she was this fragile shell, lost in a fog of forgotten memories. I should have been stronger like you, Margaret whispered, though her mother couldn't hear or understand. I should have kept working. I should have kept myself. The visit lasted 2 hours. As Margaret signed out at the front desk, the receptionist mentioned the bill. We haven't received last month's payment yet. I'll take care of it this week, Margaret promised, her anxiety spiking. She couldn't keep hiding this much longer. The drive home began uneventfully. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and fresh ice was forming over the earlier melt. Margaret drove even more carefully, barely breathing as she navigated the increasingly treacherous roads. She was 3 miles from home, on the intersection of State Boulevard and Coliseum, when she saw the truck. A semi-trailer hauling grain, going too fast for conditions. She was in the left lane, preparing to turn onto Coliseum. The light was green. The truck's driver, she'd learn later, was a 43-year-old man from Michigan who'd been on the road for 11 hours straight. He didn't see the ice. He didn't see that the light had turned red. He didn't see Margaret's Honda until it was far too late. The impact came from the passenger side, a horrific crushing sound of metal and shattering glass. Margaret's world exploded into chaos. The airbag deployed, slamming into her face. The Honda spun like a toy, rotating twice before being pushed into the concrete barrier of the overpass. Time fractured into disconnected moments. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline, the taste of blood in her mouth, the bizarre angle of her left leg, the car alarm screaming, the cold air rushing through the destroyed passenger side, pain everywhere, a white-hot agony that made her vision blur. She tried to move and couldn't. Something was pinning her legs. The dashboard had crumpled inward. The steering wheel bent at an impossible angle. Her left arm wouldn't respond. She looked down and saw bone protruding through her coat sleeve. People were shouting. Sirens in the distance. Someone's face appeared at the driver's side window. A young man with terrified eyes. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Help is coming. Stay with us." Margaret tried to answer but only managed a gurgle. Blood was pooling in her mouth. Broken ribs, punctured lung. She thought with the clinical detachment of her old nursing training. The young man's face was replaced by a paramedic, professional, efficient. "Ma'am, I'm Derek. We're going to get you out. Can you tell me your name?" "Margaret," she whispered, each word agony. "Palmer. Good. Margaret, stay with me. We're cutting you out now." The sound of the jaws of life was deafening. Metal shrieking against metal. More hands, more voices. A neck brace? Careful, controlled movements as they extracted her from the wreckage. The gray November sky above her as they loaded her onto a stretcher. The inside of the ambulance, bright and sterile. Multiple fractures, probable internal bleeding, decreased breath sounds on the left. Derek was saying into a radio, "ETA, to Parkview, trauma, 3 minutes." Margaret's mind was fading, the pain becoming distant. She thought of Robert. He should be here. Someone needed to call Robert. "My husband," she managed. "Robert Palmer, Lincoln Financial. We'll contact him, ma'am. Stay with me now." But she couldn't stay. The darkness was pulling her down, soft and inviting. Her last conscious thought was strange and specific. She'd left the pot roast uncovered in the refrigerator. Then, nothing. She didn't know that the truck driver had walked away with minor injuries. She didn't know that her injuries included 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, a shattered left femur, compound fractures in her left arm, severe head trauma, and internal bleeding requiring immediate surgery. She didn't know that the doctors gave her a 30% chance of survival. And she especially didn't know that when the hospital called Lincoln Financial Group to notify Robert Palmer that his wife had been in a critical accident, he'd asked them to text him the details because he was in an important meeting. Or that after the meeting, he'd driven not to the hospital, but to a condo on the southeast side of Fort Wayne. where a 39-year-old woman named Vanessa Richardson was waiting for him with packed suitcases and a plan they'd been constructing for 3 months. Margaret Palmer fought for her life on an operating table while her husband of 36 years chose his new one. Margaret woke to pain. Not the sharp, immediate pain of the accident, but a deep, grinding ache that seemed to emanate from every cell in her body. She tried to open her eyes and managed only a flutter. Harsh, fluorescent light stabbed through her eyelids. Sounds filtered through the fog. Beeping machines. The hiss of ventilators. Low voices discussing medications and vitals. The antiseptic smell of a hospital mixed with something else. Something metallic. Blood, she realized. Her own blood. She couldn't move. Her entire body felt encased in concrete. Panic tried to surface, but her mind was too drugged to sustain it. Fragments of memories swirled. The truck. The impact. Derek, the paramedic. Robert. She needed Robert. She's coming around, a woman's voice said. Close by. Professional. Mrs. Palmer. Can you hear me? I'm Nurse Christine. You're in Parkview Hospital. You've had surgery. You're safe now. Margaret tried to speak, but something was in her throat. A tube. Don't fight the ventilator, Mrs. Palmer. It's helping you breathe. You have a punctured lung. The tube will come out soon, but right now, your body needs the support. Hands adjusted something. The beeping changed rhythm. Margaret felt a spreading warmth that dulled the edges of pain. More medication. She drifted. Time became meaningless. She surfaced periodically to find different nurses, different lighting. Day or night, she couldn't tell. Once, a doctor's face hovered above her, explaining surgeries in words she couldn't quite grasp. Pins in her femur, plates in her arm, chest tube for her lung. Your injuries were extensive, the doctor said. His voice was kind but grave. You're very lucky to be alive, Mrs. Palmer. The next 48 hours are critical. Where was Robert? The question circled through her drugged consciousness. She needed him here, needed his hand in hers, needed to hear his voice saying she'd be okay. 36 years of marriage had to count for something. In this moment of ultimate vulnerability, surely he would be here. On what she later learned was the third day, they removed the ventilator. Margaret gasped, coughed, her throat raw from the tube. The doctor called it progress. She called it agony. Robert, she managed to croak. My husband, the nurse, a different one, named Sarah, with sympathetic eyes, hesitated. Let me check on that for you, honey. But no one came. Days passed, measured by medication schedules and physical therapy sessions, where therapists moved her shattered limbs through excruciating exercises. Her left leg was in an external fixator, metal rods piercing through her skin into bone. Her left arm was casted from shoulder to fingers. 3 broken ribs made every breath torture. On the 5th day, Margaret was coherent enough to insist. I need to call my husband, please. Someone must have made a mistake. He doesn't know I'm here. Sarah, the nurse with kind eyes, brought a phone. Margaret recited the number from memory, her heart pounding despite the pain medication. The phone rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Robert's professional greeting. You've reached Robert Palmer. Leave a message. Robert, Margaret's voice broke. It's me. I'm at Parkview. I was in an accident. I'm hurt badly. Please come, please. She called 3 more times that day. Each time, voicemail. By evening, panic had set in, despite the medications. Something was wrong. Robert should have been here. Even if work was demanding, even if he was angry about something, he should have come. Honey, Sarah said gently, is there someone else we can call? Your children? A friend? Jennifer. Margaret recited her daughter's number with shaking voice. 20 minutes later, her phone lit up with Jennifer's name. Mom. Oh my God. Mom, what happened? Why didn't Dad call me? Hearing her daughter's voice broke something in Margaret. She sobbed, each cry sending shocks of pain through her broken ribs. I don't know where he is. He won't answer. Jennifer, I'm so scared. I'm coming. Mom, I'm leaving Indianapolis right now. I'll be there in 2 hours. Hold on. Jennifer arrived at 9:30 p.m., her face pale and frightened. She took one look at her mother, covered in bandages and bruises, attached to machines and monitors, and burst into tears. Mom, Jesus Christ, you look. Why isn't Dad here? What the hell is going on? I don't know, baby. I don't know. Jennifer tried calling her father. Voicemail. She tried their home number. No answer. She called Lincoln Financial's emergency line and was told Robert Palmer had taken personal leave effective November 16th. The day after Margaret's accident, something cold settled in Margaret's chest. Personal leave. The day after her accident. This wasn't an oversight. This was a choice. Jennifer spent that night in the hospital, sleeping in the chair beside Margaret's bed. In the morning, she drove to their house on Westbury Avenue. She called Margaret from the driveway, her voice shaking. Mom, his car isn't here. The house looks empty. I'm going in. Margaret listened through the phone as her daughter walked through their home. Jennifer's footsteps echoing in the hallway. The creak of the bedroom door. Then silence, followed by a string of obscenities. Mom, his closet is empty. His dresser drawers are empty. His bathroom stuff is gone. He took his computer, his important documents. Mom, there are divorce papers on the kitchen table. They're dated November 16th. The hospital room tilted. Margaret's heart monitor began alarming. Nurses rushed in. Jennifer was still talking, but Margaret couldn't hear her anymore over the roaring in her ears. He'd left. While she was fighting for her life, while surgeons were piecing together her shattered body, while she lay unconscious and utterly vulnerable, Robert had packed his belongings and filed for divorce. The betrayal was so enormous, so complete, that her mind couldn't process it. 36 years, 3 decades of serving, supporting, sacrificing. She'd given him everything. Her career, her dreams, her identity. She'd become whatever he needed her to be. And when she needed him most, when she was broken and bleeding and terrified, he'd walked away. Sarah held Margaret's hand while the medication took effect, pulling her back under. But before the darkness came, one thought crystallized with terrible clarity. The woman she'd been no longer existed. The life she'd lived was ash. Everything she'd built, every sacrifice she'd made, every piece of herself she'd surrendered, had been for nothing. She was 58 years old, catastrophically injured, abandoned, and utterly alone. The husband who'd promised to love her in sickness and in health had disappeared like smoke. The future she'd imagined, growing old together, grandchildren, retirement, had been a fantasy. Jennifer stayed, but Margaret saw the panic in her daughter's eyes. Jennifer had a career, responsibilities, a life in Indianapolis. She couldn't stay indefinitely. Their son Michael was in Korea, couldn't get emergency leave for months. When Margaret woke the next morning, Jennifer was on the phone with her father's attorney. The conversation was heated, Jennifer's voice rising with each exchange. She has nothing. He emptied the bank accounts. What do you mean that's legal? She's in the ICU. She can't even walk. How is she supposed to? This is insane. You're telling me my mother has no recourse while she's lying here with metal rods in her leg? Margaret closed her eyes. The full reality was settling in like frost. No money. No home. Not really. The house was in both names, but Robert's attorney would fight for it. No health insurance. Once the divorce finalized, she'd been on Robert's plan. No job prospects. No savings. She was broken in body and now broken in circumstances. The woman who'd spent decades ensuring her husband's comfort was now discarded like damaged goods. And the worst part, the part that made her want to stop breathing, was the question that wouldn't leave her mind. Had she ever mattered to him at all? Or had she been simply convenient, a service provider who'd outlived her usefulness? The pot roast she'd worried about in the ambulance was probably rotting in the refrigerator of a house she could no longer call home. Just like their marriage, just like her. Margaret spent 19 days in Parkview Hospital. Each day brought new humiliations, new pain, new realizations about how completely her life had imploded. The surgeries had saved her life, but left her dependent on others for the most basic functions. She needed help bathing, dressing, using the bathroom. The woman who'd prided herself on taking care of everyone else now couldn't take care of herself. Jennifer had to return to Indianapolis after 2 weeks. Her employer had been understanding, but she had deadlines, clients, responsibilities. The guilt on her daughter's face when she said goodbye was almost worse than the abandonment itself. "Mom, I'll come every weekend. I'll call every day. We're going to figure this out." But Margaret could see the fear in Jennifer's eyes. Her daughter was 36, building her own life. She shouldn't have to parent her parent. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. The social worker, a weary woman named Patricia, delivered the news about insurance with practiced sympathy. "Your husband's employer provided insurance will terminate 30 days after the divorce is finalized. Given your injuries, you'll need extended rehabilitation, home health care, continued orthopedic treatment. We're looking at hundreds of thousands in medical costs. How long until the divorce is final? Indiana has a 60-day waiting period from filing. Given you were incapacitated and couldn't contest, it could be finalized by mid-January. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks before her lifeline to medical care was cut. Patricia continued, "You'll need to apply for Medicaid, but that takes time. In the meantime, we're looking at discharge options. Do you have family who can take you in?" Margaret thought of Jennifer's one-bedroom condo, Michael in Korea, her siblings scattered across the country, all with their own struggles. No. Friends who could provide temporary housing. The question hung in the air. Friends. Did she have friends? Dorothy from book club, who she barely knew. The neighbors on Westbury Avenue, who'd been pleasant acquaintances for decades, but never intimates. Robert had been her social circle, his colleagues, his world. She'd let all her own friendships atrophy years ago. "No," she whispered again. Patricia's expression softened. "Then we're looking at a skilled nursing facility. I have a list of places that accept Medicaid pending. They're not ideal, but they'll provide basic care while you heal." Nursing home. She was 58 years old and going to a nursing home. The same type of place where her mother sat confused and forgotten. The irony was crushing. On day 23, Margaret was transferred to Meadowbrook Rehabilitation and Extended Care on the south side of Fort Wayne. The facility was exactly as depressing as she'd imagined. Sterile hallways, smelling of urine and industrial cleaner. Residents parked in wheelchairs along the walls, staring at nothing. Underpaid, overworked staff, doing their best with impossible ratios. Her room was shared with an 82-year-old woman named Edith, who had late-stage Alzheimer's and screamed periodically throughout the night. The space was maybe 10 by 12 feet, divided by a thin curtain. Margaret's half contained a hospital bed, a rolling tray table, and a plastic chair. Everything she owned in the world fit in 2 garbage bags Jennifer had packed from the house. The physical therapy at Meadowbrook was minimal. 3 times a week, a therapist would help her practice walking with a walker, each session lasting maybe 30 minutes. The rest of the time, she sat in her bed or the common room, watching television shows she didn't care about, eating food that tasted like cardboard. But the physical degradation was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. Margaret had time now, endless empty time, to process what had happened. To really understand that Robert had planned this. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the emotional distance that had seemed normal because it had been gradual. He'd been preparing his exit for months, maybe longer. And he'd waited for her to be helpless before executing his plan. The timing wasn't coincidence. The divorce papers dated the day after her accident. He'd known she couldn't fight back, couldn't contest, couldn't do anything but survive. It was so calculated, so cold, that it redefined everything she thought she knew about their marriage. Had any of it been real? Had he ever loved her, or had she simply been useful? The other revelation came slower, more painful. She'd enabled this. Every time she'd silenced her own needs, every time she'd made herself smaller to accommodate him, every time she'd chosen peace over truth, she'd taught him that she didn't matter. She'd trained him over decades that her value was in service, not in self. She'd sacrificed her nursing career, her independence, her identity, and he'd accepted those sacrifices as his due. She'd become invisible in her own life, and when invisible things break, no one notices. The anger came in waves. Sometimes she'd be sitting in the common room, and rage would flood through her, so intensely she'd shake. Other times, despair so deep she couldn't breathe. Grief for the wasted years. Shame that she'd allowed it. Terror about her future. On a cold December afternoon, 6 weeks into her stay at Meadowbrook, a lawyer showed up. Not Robert's lawyer, but a woman named Karen Rodriguez from Neighborhood Legal Services, a nonprofit that provided free legal aid. "Your daughter contacted us," Karen said, settling into the plastic chair beside Margaret's bed. She was maybe 40, with intelligent eyes and a nonsense manner. "She's worried about you. Tell me everything." Margaret told her. The accident, the abandonment, the divorce papers, the emptied bank accounts, the house she couldn't afford to fight for, the medical bills mounting, the complete erasure of 36 years. Karen took notes, her expression growing harder. "Mrs. Palmer, what your husband did was legal, but it wasn't ethical. Indiana is an equitable distribution state. You're entitled to a fair division of marital assets, the house, his retirement accounts, his pension. Just because you couldn't contest doesn't mean you can't fight now. I don't have money for a lawyer. That's why I'm here. We take cases like yours pro bono, and honestly, I'd love to take this to court. Men who abandon their wives when they're critically injured need to face consequences." Something stirred in Margaret. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Agency. The possibility of fighting back. What would we be fighting for? Everything. Half the house equity, half his retirement, spousal support while you get back on your feet. And I want his employer to know what he did. I want his new girlfriend to know. I want everyone in his smug little world to know that he walked away from his critically injured wife. Karen's fury on her behalf was unexpected and overwhelming. Margaret began to cry, tears streaming down her face. Someone was fighting for her. Someone thought she deserved better. Why are you helping me? Karen's expression softened slightly. Because I've seen too many women in your situation. Women who gave up everything for their marriages, then got discarded when they were no longer convenient. The system is rigged against you, Mrs. Palmer, but that doesn't mean we can't fight. Are you willing to fight? Margaret thought about the pot roast, the thousands of meals she'd cooked that went unappreciated, the nursing career she'd abandoned. The woman she'd been at 22, confident and capable. The woman she could have been. Yes, she said. I want to fight. Karen smiled, sharp and determined. Good. Then let's make Robert Palmer very, very sorry he tried to erase you. Over the next weeks, Karen built her case. She subpoenaed Robert's financial records and found he'd been hiding money for 8 months. She discovered the condo he'd rented with Vanessa Richardson. She found evidence he'd been planning the divorce since March, nearly a year before the accident. She also did something unexpected. She leaked the story to the local news. On a cold January evening, Fort Wayne's Channel 15 ran a segment titled Abandoned in Crisis. They didn't name names, but anyone who knew the Palmers would recognize the story. A local wife, critically injured in a November accident, discovered her husband had filed for divorce and emptied their accounts while she fought for her life in the ICU. The story went viral locally. Social media exploded. Robert's LinkedIn was flooded with comments. Someone identified him and Vanessa posted their photos. The court of public opinion was merciless. Lincoln Financial Group quietly asked Robert to resign. His reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was destroyed in days. Margaret watched it all from Meadowbrook with complicated feelings. She'd wanted him to face consequences, but seeing his life implode brought no satisfaction. Just a hollow emptiness where her marriage used to be. But Karen wasn't finished. She took the divorce case back to court, arguing that Margaret had been unable to properly contest due to her medical incapacitation. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, agreed. She ordered a complete financial accounting and froze Robert's assets pending new proceedings. Mrs. Palmer, the judge said during one hearing, Margaret attended via video call from Meadowbrook. I've seen many divorce cases, but few as egregious as this. Your husband will not profit from his abandonment. In February, 3 months after the accident, the new divorce settlement was finalized. Margaret received half the house equity, $400,000. Half of Robert's retirement accounts, another $300,000, and spousal support of $3,000 monthly for 10 years. It wasn't everything she'd lost, but it was enough to rebuild. Karen visited her the day the money transferred. You did it, Mrs. Palmer. You fought, and you won. Margaret looked at the bank statement on her phone. $700,000. More money than she'd ever had in her own name. Financial security for the first time in her life. But the victory felt hollow, because the woman who'd needed this money, who deserved this security 36 years ago, no longer existed. The Margaret Palmer who'd walked down the aisle in 1987, full of dreams and promise, had died slowly over decades of neglect. The accident had just made it official. Thank you, Margaret said, for everything. Karen squeezed her hand. What will you do now? Margaret looked out the window of her shared room at Meadowbrook. Spring was coming, snow melting into mud. She was 59 now, still using a walker, still in physical therapy, still broken in so many ways. But she had money. She had options. She had, for the first time in decades, the freedom to choose her own path. I don't know yet, she said, but it will be mine. Spring 2024 came to Fort Wayne with the tentative hope of thawing earth and returning birds. Margaret stood at the window of her new apartment, watching rain streak down the glass, and marveled at the simple fact of standing. 4 months ago, that had been impossible. The apartment was modest, a one-bedroom on the second floor of a complex on the northwest side of the city. She'd chosen it specifically for the elevator and the grab bars in the bathroom. At 59, recovering from catastrophic injuries, she needed to be practical, but it was hers, her name on the lease. Her furniture, purchased new, her space. The first month after leaving Meadowbrook had been terrifying. She'd hired a home health aide, a kind Kenyan woman named Grace who came 3 times a week to help with tasks Margaret still couldn't manage alone. Grocery shopping, carrying laundry, reaching high shelves. Grace treated her with dignity, something Margaret had forgotten she deserved. Physical therapy continued at an outpatient clinic. Her therapist, Marcus, was a 28-year-old former college athlete who pushed her mercilessly and celebrated every small victory. Walking unassisted for 5 minutes, climbing a full flight of stairs, lifting a gallon of milk. "You're doing great, Mrs. Palmer," he'd say. "Most people your age with your injuries never get this far. Most people your age." The phrase stung, but Margaret forced herself to accept it. She was 59. She'd been in a near-fatal accident. Her body would never be what it was, but it could be functional. It could be strong in new ways. Jennifer visited every other weekend, relief evident in her eyes each time she saw her mother's progress. They were rebuilding their relationship too, finding a new dynamic where Margaret was recovering her strength instead of being a burden. "You look good, Mom," Jennifer said in April, watching Margaret make coffee in her small kitchen. "Really good, stronger." "I feel stronger," Margaret admitted. Not just physically. She'd started therapy, real therapy, with a psychologist named Dr. Linda Chen, who specialized in trauma and life transitions. Twice a week, Margaret sat in Dr. Chen's comfortable office and unpacked 36 years of denial. "You're grieving multiple losses," Dr. Chen explained during one session. "Your health, your marriage, the life you thought you had, but also the life you gave up, the nurse you could have been, the woman you were before you started making yourself smaller." "I'm angry," Margaret confessed. "At Robert, yes, but mostly at myself. For allowing it. Allowing suggests you had a choice. Did you feel you had a choice?" Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. No, not really. It happened so gradually. Little accommodations that became expectations. And I was raised to believe a wife's job was to support her husband. And now I think that was bullshit. The curse word felt foreign in her mouth, rebellious. She smiled. Complete bullshit. Dr. Chen smiled back. "That's progress." In May, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Dorothy Chen, from the book club she'd never attended, showed up at her apartment with a casserole and a determined expression. "I heard what happened," Dorothy said, inviting herself in. "The whole city knows, and I feel terrible that I didn't reach out sooner. I should have checked on you. We all should have." Margaret made tea, her hands steady now as she poured. "I wasn't really part of any community. That's my fault. It's never too late." Dorothy settled onto the couch. Book club still meets. We'd love to have you. And there's a women's support group at the community center. Divorced women, widows, some who've been through medical crises. They call themselves the Phoenix Group, rising from ashes. You know, I think you'd fit right in. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, to stay in her safe solitude. But that instinct came from the old Margaret, the one who'd made herself small. The new Margaret, the one being born from this catastrophe, needed connection. I'd like that, she said. The Phoenix Group met Tuesday evenings at the Fort Wayne Community Center. 12 women, ages 47 to 72, all survivors of various life implosions. Margaret sat in the circle that first night in June, listening to their stories. Rita, 63, whose husband had left her for a man after 30 years of marriage. Sandra, 55, who'd survived breast cancer only to find her husband couldn't handle her mastectomy scars. Paula, 68, widowed after her husband's sudden heart attack, discovering he'd emptied their retirement account gambling. Stories of betrayal, loss, survival, but also stories of rebuilding. Rita had gone back to school, was getting her master's degree in social work. Sandra had started a nonprofit supporting women after mastectomies. Paula had become a financial counselor, helping women understand money. What about you, Margaret? The group leader asked. What are you rebuilding toward? Margaret realized she didn't know. She'd been so focused on healing, on settling the divorce, on simply surviving, that she hadn't thought about what came next. I was a nurse, she said slowly. A long time ago, before I gave it up. Could you go back to nursing? Rita asked. I'm 59. My license expired decades ago. Medicine has changed completely, but the core of nursing hasn't changed, Sandra said. Caring for people, being present for them in their vulnerability. You know how to do that. The idea took root. Margaret started researching. Her license could be reinstated if she completed continuing education courses and passed the NCLEX exam again. It would take time, maybe a year of study. At 60, she'd be starting over, but starting over beat fading away. That summer, Margaret enrolled in an online nursing refresher course. She studied at her kitchen table, her laptop open to lessons about electronic medical records and new protocols. The medical knowledge came flooding back, muscle memory of the mind. She'd forgotten how much she loved this, the precision of understanding how the body worked, the satisfaction of knowing how to help. Jennifer came for a weekend in July and found her mother surrounded by textbooks and notes. Mom, are you seriously doing this? Going back to nursing? I'm seriously trying. I don't know if any hospital will hire a 60-year-old woman with a rebuilt leg and arm, but I have to try. Jennifer hugged her, tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you. You know that. You could have given up. You had every reason to give up, but you're fighting. I spent 36 years not fighting, Margaret said. I'm done with that. The Phoenix Group became her anchor. Tuesday evenings, she'd sit in that circle and share her progress, her setbacks, her fears. These women understood in ways her daughter couldn't. They'd all been erased in various ways, and they'd all chosen to redraw themselves. In August, Paula mentioned a position. My friend works at the community clinic on Broadway. They're looking for nurses. Part-time, mostly serving uninsured and low-income patients. It's not glamorous, but it's nursing. Margaret applied, her hands shaking as she filled out the online form. She listed her work history, the 30-year gap glaring obvious. In the cover letter, she was honest. I gave up nursing to raise my family. Life circumstances have brought me back to my first calling. I may be older, but I remember what it means to care. The interview was in September. The clinic director, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Ramesh, studied Margaret across the desk. You understand this is hard work? Long days on your feet, difficult patients, not a lot of resources? I understand. I also understand what it's like to be vulnerable and need care, to be invisible. I won't make my patients feel invisible. Dr. Ramesh smiled. You start Monday. 20 hours a week to begin. Margaret walked out of that clinic into the September sunshine and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of mattering again. Of having purpose beyond service to someone else's life. She called Jennifer. I got it. I'm a nurse again. Jennifer's whoop of joy echoed through the phone. Mom, that's amazing. We need to celebrate. That weekend, Jennifer drove up from Indianapolis. They went to Cindy's Diner on Calhoun Street, ordered too much food, and talked for hours. Real conversation, the kind Margaret had forgotten, was possible. You're different, Jennifer said. I don't mean just recovered from the accident. You're more present, more yourself. I didn't have a self for a long time, Margaret admitted. I was Robert's wife, your mother, roles I played, but not me. Are you happy? Margaret considered the question. Happy seemed too simple a word for what she felt. She was scarred, physically and emotionally. She had days where the pain was overwhelming, where the betrayal felt fresh. She was 59, starting over with a rebuilt body and limited time. But she was also free. She made her own decisions. She had work that mattered. She had friends who saw her. She had a daughter who respected her. She had, for the first time in decades, herself. I'm becoming happy, she said. I think that's better than just being happy. It means I'm working toward something. In October, 1 year after the accident, Margaret stood at the grave of her mother. Eleanor had died in August, her mind gone long before her body failed. Margaret placed flowers on the headstone and spoke aloud. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger sooner. Mom, I'm sorry I let myself disappear, but I'm finding my way back. I think you'd be proud. The Phoenix Group threw her a 1-year survivor party. They called it that explicitly, because survival was an active choice. Cake, balloons, the whole celebration. Each woman shared what Margaret's journey had meant to them. You showed us it's never too late, Rita said. You were nearly 60, broken in every way, and you still chose to rebuild. That gave me courage. Margaret looked around the circle at these women who'd become her chosen family. You all saved me. I thought I was alone. You taught me I wasn't. The question of Robert came up in therapy occasionally. Margaret had learned through Jennifer that he and Vanessa had moved to Indianapolis, that his career had never recovered, that he was working in a position far below his previous role. That they'd had to sell their condo when the market turned. How does that make you feel? Dr. Chen asked. Sad, Margaret said honestly. Not for him, for all the wasted years. For who we both could have been if we'd been braver. But mostly, I don't think about him much anymore. He's not the center of my story. He was just what's the next? Margaret smiled. I'm writing it, that's the point. In November 2024, 2 years after the accident, Margaret was promoted to full-time at the clinic. She'd proven herself indispensable. Her combination of medical knowledge and genuine empathy making her patient's favorite nurse. Dr. Ramesh pulled her aside after her shift. Margaret, you're exactly what this clinic needs. You see our patients as people, not problems. That's rare. Margaret thought about her time in Meadowbrook, invisible and forgotten. I know what it's like to be treated as a problem. I never want anyone to feel that way. That evening, she returned to her apartment, made dinner for herself, and sat by the window watching snow begin to fall. Fort Wayne in November looked like it had 2 years ago, but everything was different. She was 60 years old. She had scars that would never fully heal, a slight limp she'd carry forever, limitations she'd have to accept. She lived modestly in a one-bedroom apartment. She worked 25 hours a week at a community clinic. She drove a used Toyota Camry Jennifer had helped her pick out. On paper, it wasn't much. Certainly not the comfortable middle-class life she'd had on Westbury Avenue, but it was hers. Every single piece of it was hers. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dorothy. Book club, tomorrow. We're discussing The Midnight Library. Your pick, remember? Margaret smiled. She'd been the one to suggest the book, about a woman given the chance to try different versions of her life. The group had loved it, had talked for hours about choices and regrets and second chances. She texted back, wouldn't miss it. Another text came through, this one from Grace. Mrs. Palmer, I'm moving back to Kenya next month. Family needs me. But I wanted to say you inspired me. Watching you rebuild your life gave me courage to go home and start over. Thank you. Margaret sat with that message for a long moment. She'd inspired someone. Her story, her struggle, had mattered to another person. The nurse who'd once felt invisible had become visible in ways she'd never imagined. She opened her laptop and pulled up an email she'd been composing for weeks. It was to Parkview Hospital's volunteer coordinator. The email explained her background, her experience, her desire to volunteer with patients who were alone and frightened. Patients like she'd been. She hit send. The past couldn't be changed. Robert's betrayal, the wasted years, the accident, all of it was permanent history. But the future was unwritten. And Margaret Palmer, survivor, was holding the pen. She stood at the window, watching Snowdust, the city she'd called home for nearly 4 decades. Fort Wayne had witnessed her diminishment and her reconstruction. These streets had seen her broken and rebuilding. Tomorrow, she'd wake at 6, not to serve someone else's breakfast, but to prepare for work that mattered. She'd check on Mr. Rodriguez's blood pressure, comfort Mrs. Washington through her diabetes diagnosis, advocate for young Marcus to get the medication he needed. She'd live her life on her own terms. The woman she'd been at 22, fresh out of nursing school, full of dreams, would barely recognize the woman she'd become at 30, 40, 50. That woman had been systematically erased. But the woman she was at 60? That woman was a phoenix. Burned down to ash, yes, but rising, always rising. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.